Tricks from soldering, and I'm actually going to have to move this magnifying glass off to the side. So sorry, you might see my head pop in and out from all this stuff, but what I'm actually going to do is, what I like to do is I like to start off the solder a little bit. So here's the soldering tip, and I put just a smidge of this on there to get it going. You see, you don't really see much, but that's basically what I'm doing, is I'm just kind of getting the solder wet, and I'm getting the iron wet and getting a little bit of solder on there. Then what I actually start to do is what I like to do is heat up each little pin just a certain amount, and I put the actual soldering iron on the other side. Let me see if I can position this better. So what I'm actually going to do here is I'm going to go ahead, and what I found is that when you solder, you got to be quick about it, and you got to be clean about it. Now, one of the tricks behind the soldering is that the actual solder goes towards the heat. So in this case, what you want to do is you want to put it on the opposite side. Now, as you can see, I'm not sure if you can see it too well or not, but I've already gone ahead and I've soldered one of those pins in place, and it's this one right there. I've soldered that in place, and what I did is I allowed the solder to literally fall into the hole that it was in. So it fell into that hole, and I put the solder on the other side while I had the iron on the other. And I did that to get a nice solder going on. Now what you can do is, now that you have one there, as you can see I have one there, I'm going to go ahead and move this clamp over, because now I don't need it to really hold down the headers anymore. So I'm going to be careful where I put it. Wish this would focus a little bit better. Let's see if I can get it to focus here for us. Well, let's go ahead and do the rest. The rest shouldn't be too hard. Again, you want to make sure that you get enough drip in the hole. And keep the heat on the opposite side. That way the solder goes towards that. So there you have it. I've gone ahead, I've soldered the board. It has its headers now. That's all it took. It's just wood. There we go. And we're done with that. See, that didn't take too long. Wasn't that difficult. There we go. As you can see, you have hot headers that are nicely soldered onto the board, and it looks somewhat professional. Now, sometimes I go a little overboard with the actual solder. So what I wind up doing is I go ahead and I take just your basic wire cutter. Now, I didn't show that in the beginning of this video, but I'm going to show it to you now, just a basic wire cutter. Now, I'm not going to do it here because I don't need to, but sometimes these tips get a little long, and I just kind of snip it up a little bit. You have to be careful when you do that, because when you do that, solder is brittle. So what happens when you start snipping away like that, you might actually crack it and ruin the contact there. So, be careful when you do that, and it's only do it if you have excess solder. That's the only time. In this case, I have no excess solder. This came out pretty clean, and we're good to go with this one. I can now use this in any project that I want. The only bad thing, side comment about this, is that this is a, this is a compass, and this compass basically, or an accelerometer, I believe, sorry, it's got no mounting holes, so it makes this somewhat challenging to mount. But that's for another discussion. We're really just talking about the actual soldering. Again, take a look here. Let's let that, see how nice and neat that's soldered. Make sure that when you do solder, none of these contacts overlap each other, because, well, they can't. there can be a space there. Now that's when you want to go ahead and take your magnifying glass and do a final inspection. Now I can already see that it's okay, but I'll do the final inspection here, and everything looks good. I'm not sure if you'll be able to see it or not, but everything is looking good here. Let's see. So I don't see any problems there. Everything looks clean. So we're good to go. So that concludes that portion of the tutorial. Next part is just basic soldering of wires. Now here we have two wires that I have cut, and I've used, I've cut it for other reasons, not for this tutorial, but I cut them, and now I need to put them together for whatever reason or another. Normally what I would suggest is putting heat shrink on one of these guys beforehand and then actually doing what I'm going to do, but in this case we're not going to use heat shrink, we're just doing the soldering. So you take your wire strippers and you find the right gauge for this wire and you just pull it out. There you go. Leaves the little plastic sheath right on the pliers, and here you have a wire exposed. Next part is I'm going to go ahead and do this one as well, and we're done. So now these are exposed. Now I've seen various techniques for soldering these guys together. I often don't have to solder too many wires together, but what I like to do is I kind of like to just put them together and leave them unraveled first. So I'm leaving the two wires unraveled, and I'm letting them kind of interweave with each other, and I'm just, at that point, I'm just going to kind of give it a nice little twist. And that's it. Just a twist, enough twist to kind of hold it together. And that's it. Now again, I'm going to go ahead and use my alligator clip, but this time it's just more for holding on to it. I don't really need it to hold the two wires together. Let me kind of position this. There we go. And again, just like the other stuff, let's see if I can get this in a better shot here. Okay, so again, remember that solder travels the solder always travels towards the heat, and you don't often need that much solder to get the job done. So this one you just kind of liberally, you can go ahead and heat up the wire, which would probably be the ideal way. But what often happens there when you heat up the wire is that you wind up melting everything. So once you get some solder on the wire, you can kind of just move it around and make sure it's all coated. That's it. We have now soldered together a piece of wire, and it's ready to go. As you can see, nothing special there, just some basic solder. Should suffice for whatever you're trying to do. And remember, solder gets pretty warm. It gets cool right away, so don't feel shy to touch it and make sure it's okay. And just remember, when you do solder wires together, that little contact right there is brittle. Notice how flexible this wire is in another spot, but over here it gets a little, can't really bend that too much. So just be aware of that whenever you do solder wires together. And worst case scenario, if you ever mess up, it's just wire. Go ahead and snip each end and start over. I really don't need to have these soldered together, so that's why I'm taking it out. But here is the actual piece that we just cut off. That's it. That's soldering. Didn't want to get it too complicated. I wanted to keep it simple. And again, I'm not an electrical engineer. I'm a computer science guy. Software's my thing, but I do understand how to do many of these things. And I definitely would suggest, if you're going to be doing a lot of soldering, that you practice first. Practice on things, because, for example, I went ahead and just went straight on and started soldering the headers on this board, but this particular board here cost about $50. So you don't want to experiment on a $50 component. I'm more than sure of that. Otherwise, you're going to wind up going through a lot of money and ruining a lot of components. So what I suggest is practice, practice, practice. Get a breadboard that costs you about 50 cents. And get a breadboard, get some headers, practice soldering them on there and getting them ready. And that should be about it. I mean, and also with the wires, you can practice with as much wire as you want. That concludes this demonstration, and I hope this helps out.